Good morning and welcome back to another episode of the Red Chip Poker Podcast. I'm your host, James Blitzsuit Sweeney, joined as always by Chris Warren. And Chris, today I wanted to talk about preflop calling. So we've talked a lot about GTO this season. We've talked a lot about 3-betting and just general aggression, both preflop and postflop. Now let's kind of switch gears and go to more of the passive angle and calling overall. So talk a little bit about kind of how this has changed over the years, because this whole conversation kind of came from a YouTube comment. Someone was, we're talking about kind of preflop ranges, and they noticed, hey, there's not really a lot of preflop calling going on here. It's either like a 3-bet or fold kind of strategy preflop, and that's changed a lot over the years, at least in terms of like general principles. How have you seen this change over time?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple major things that have happened. So first of all, when we really started off thinking about like what hands we could play, like for the most part, we were looking at a database analysis, looking at these hands and whether they were making a profit calling or not. And so that's still a good source of data, honestly. If you have lots of data that's specific to the game that you're playing, and a hand is a profitable call, you can make it a profitable call. So we're happy to build around that. But that's kind of like the only piece of data we had. And the major iterations have been that we've actually seen GTO strategies come up where we can run the solver, figure out exactly what's profitable and what's not. And it turns out when you have a full GTO strategy, which is going to include folding, 3-betting, and calling, the calling range is very, very tight. It would be stereotypically, say, like a lot of combos of things like ace queen and tens right in that middle of the range, but only really go down to maybe like smaller percentages of 8s and 7s. And all the hands that you would call pretty much are still majority 3-bets in most situations. And we also saw that like we don't get a lot of calls outside of the button. So and this is in a 6-max game. In a live game, there's more calls from versus under the gun raises. But those are basically our major sources of preflop data, and that GTO has really changed how we think about it.
Yeah, so when we were first doing our additional runs of solves last year, one of the major insights you brought almost immediately when you were kind of pouring through some of that initial data was you're like, okay, it looks like there are like only 2 spots where we could realistically even consider calling as like a basic default part of the strategy, the button and the big blind. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, there's certainly other spots we can consider calling, but those strategies are, for our purposes, where we were building that beginner strategy, it just didn't look like it was worthwhile for the complexity that it would create.
So I think that's a really important part of it, is we are trying to input some simplifications into the ranges that we're suggesting, especially the preflop ranges, both in core and in pro, and we kind of sucked most of the calls out just for simplification purposes. Like you mentioned, most of the calling range would have been very, very kind of snug and predictable anyway, and a lot of those hands kind of leaned more 3-bet than call in the first place, so just simplify to 3-bets. Someone hearing this is going to say, no, that can't possibly be right? By eliminating an entire option from your preflop strategy, how could that possibly be better than calling sometimes? And, why simplify? Why is that even good in a situation like this?
Yeah. And I think that's almost every player's bias, is that poker is a game about choosing which hands you play, and picking hands to call is just it's so ingrained into poker culture, and playing hands is fun, and just all these biases that we have. But when we're really looking at what is the most effective strategy, there's really not a lot of indication that calling is that important. At the very highest levels, where people are manipulating raise sizes and the rake is very low, yes, calling does become a bit more important. But even then, I think we constantly see even high 6 players, I think, just drastically misplaying how much they're calling and why they're calling. And, one of the main principles I always bank on is that if you have a profitable 3-bet, you should generally almost always lock all those hands in and start there. Even if it's like, a wider range or whatever. If you have a profitable 3-bet, it's the clarity and the strategy, just the fact that a profitable 3-bet would either just be your GTO, baseline strength, or just people are over folding and giving up too frequently post flop. that is such an powerful foundation that just we know how it works. It's so simple. Compared to calling, we have to like all of a sudden balance out all our post flop play and deal with the fact that our ranges are capped. It just adds so much complexity. And I just find even with something like a button call, where you're saying, how much does it really add? I know throughout my entire career, I've really emphasized the three betting, and I've had some of the highest win rates possible in the game. So I don't really think it limits anything. And because of that, we tend to push people to three bet more and more.
But I think in there is a very, very important point, because I think if we dig a layer or two under there, is most people like calling because they're like, okay, this is going to be plus EV. But as I say way too often, just because something is plus EV does not mean that it's optimal, or that it's the most plus EV option available. Because let's just say you're on the button, you're facing a raise. If you have king queen suited, sure, you're not going to fold it, no problem. So you could always, if you're not going to fold it, you only have two options left: call it or three bet it. Well, calling is cheaper, calling feels safer, so we'll just smash it there because it doesn't feel strong enough to three bet. So not going to fold, not going to three bet, so have to call. And I think that's where a lot of people kind of started their poker strategy overall. It's just looking at the prettiness of their hand and then determining, okay, this isn't kings plus, so I can't three bet it, and just shunting a whole bunch of stuff into the calling range. For these people, going into a three better fold is going to be very, very tough. I feel like it's going to take a lot of convincing to go there, and I think part of that is that people feel very uncomfortable in three bet pots. So I mean, people are risk averse generally anyway. I mean, that's why you see so little three betting, especially in like smaller live games, 1, 2, 2, 5, etc. And I think that's really where people don't want to get three betting, because they don't want to have to play those pots post flop, and they kind of miss a lot of opportunity along the way.
Yeah, I think it's the most common bias that we see is that players are averse to three betting. And the thing you just have to understand is that poker is a hard game. And our goal, I think, as poker players is really like an optimal strategy is going to push up against our levels of comfort. I think almost by design, right? Like the inflection points where the most profitable plays are, will be thinner. They will bring you to that line. You will be risking more money with a thinner edge in some situations. And because of that, that's what makes poker profitable, right? Is that making the right play is difficult. And so when we say, there's a 99.9% chance you call too much, it's because of these biases. It's not because people don't understand that aggression is good and that three betting is good. In fact, we often find once players kind of understand the power of three betting, they tend to go too far. And it's just that human bias of wanting to play hands, wanting to reduce risk. It has no basis in what is the actual effective strategy. That is your bias, and you have to account for that. And it's almost universal, right? We have a small group of players who go super tight and only want to have the nuts. But other than that, almost everyone else calls too much.
That's a very fair point, because once you get the taste of, hey, three betting is pretty fun, and hey, people are folding a lot, it is very easy to go way too overboard. As someone who has done that multiple times in their poker career, had to like constantly go too far, then rein it back in, then go too far again, and then rein it back in. It's kind of like this lifelong journey for the aggressive player who especially wants to be more on the lag spectrum. You're just going to be doing that kind of forever. So if we've taken someone and said, okay, we're going to kind of remove calling from most of your preflop strategy, like most all of it. So you're kind of a three better fold kind of player now. How do we stop this person from going too far in general? And also, what should they be looking for in terms of things to not kind of jump too far into, right? So like shorter stacks obviously are a massive turnoff for getting like super, super three bet happy. But what are some other spots that you might want to start reining in that three betting, and again, still not calling? Where are some of those spots pre-flop?
Yeah, I think the best way to visualize this is, just as human players, we tend to think in terms of individual hands. But, the thing James and I say again and again is that you need to play your entire range. And when we're talking about pre-flop, that means you're playing a frequency. You're three betting at a certain frequency. You're calling at a certain frequency. And it's all specific to the situation you're in. But because of that, we know how much we need to three bet from a GTO perspective. Basically, in my opinion, if the stack sizes are 100 big blinds, that three bet range that we'll have, if we say run a solve, those hands should almost always be three bet, unless you have some really extreme situation. It's just, we know this is profitable. We know this is the right frequency. It'll protect our value range. It'll mix well with our weaker hands. It's just the best strategy. When you just look at it overall, it's like all of your bluffs are just enough. It's like that 20 to 30%, weakness that makes playing against your value range difficult. That's really kind of, and it's a little weird pre-flop because like, is king queen suited a value hand? It's always hard to say, but that's kind of the mix we're looking for. Is like, we're playing really good, really strong hands and just adding a few mixes. And similarly, our calling strategy needs to have that frequency based, I'm playing my entire range mentality as well. And that's actually why when we look at a GTO strategy, it's literally, I'm trying to think of the exact number of combos, but say we have like a standard cutoff open and we're on the button, and you're really looking at calling like 15% of your ace queen suited, maybe ace queen off gets flatted less, so you do that. But like a lot of your hands are literally it's going to be call 15% of tens, call 5% of your ace king off, call 5% of your jacks, and these are your hands that you would use to defend against squeezing and things like that. And then your sevens are going to be called at like 10%, and your sixes are going to be called maybe 5% or 0%. And it's just such a tight range compared to what most people are calling. They just don't understand that like your calling range from a GTO perspective needs to be protected. You need to be super strong because you're actually taking away your nut advantage by not having the top of your range. And because of this, one of the simplest ways to think about calling that I've come up with, I think most people kind of understand this, but that calling is an exploitative strategy, right? And so we need to be looking for things that we can exploit when we call.
So let's go through some of those things, because I think that's really important. Once we understand, okay, we're looking to play a range here, right? We're not just looking to call king queen or whatever, because that's really what happens, right? Is people just get very, very call happy. All of a sudden their calling frequency is like 20%, their three bet is like 4%, and they fold the rest of it, but like they're calling a tremendous amount of hands, but they never call the nut hands, or like rarely. So they're always in the situation where, I mean, like you said earlier, they're hyper capped post flop, and cool beans, good luck with that. But when it comes to like the exploitative side of things, what are a couple of spots where we can call more exploitatively? Like, what are we looking for in these spots?
Yeah. So once we're thinking exploitatively, it really starts to outline, I think, the variables that we need. And so the first thing to understand with calling is that it's really all about your pot odds, right? If someone min raises and you're in the big blind, we call a ton of hands. We're required to. And even though we will actually check fold a lot pre-flop or post-flop, we call a lot of hands because the odds are great. And so even when you're calling in position, you have to be thinking in terms of pot odds. That is really the goal here. And then what can adjust our pot odds? And these are the things where we can start taking into account those player tendencies. So if we have a player that we have position on who is very passive, that's going to increase our pot odds, right? Because it's going to allow us to show down more of our hands. It's going to allow us to pick out better bluffs with more information. That's a good situation where you will have more pot odds if that player is very passive who open raised. That's tricky, right? Because if they're passive, were they open raising aggressively enough? So there's a interesting dynamic there where you often won't get amazing odds to call. Of course, the raise size, is another one. So if someone's min raising, like, it's totally viable to call more frequently than if they open 5x. And then this is one of the most important dynamics in a live game, is that, a lot of times open raises are 5x the blind. 15x the blind in crazier games, right? And because of that, your odds for calling are just not very good. And so when we're looking at live game calls, it's usually situations where we couldn't three bet and our hand is just so strong and so appealing to call. A good example would be like, the under the gun razor opens and we have jacks and queens or something like that. Obviously strong enough to compete for, say, 50% of the pot. Probably not strong enough to three bet for value against some tighter players. So therefore we just call because we're essentially getting pot odds, but it's with a hand that's just very strong. And we probably wouldn't be getting pot odds with something like pocket twos, which is what every live player would call in that situation.
Fair enough. And those are, by the way, the same spots where I'm looking to, like the queens and jack spots, is where I'm also considering, hey, could I just call with aces and kings here too? Like, could I shunt more of my continuance into calling in that situation? So that way I don't just totally cap myself at like exactly three hands. And I'm also totally okay if it invites the squeeze or something like that behind. Depends on stack sizes from the other players as well. But just one of those spots where I'm like, I'll at least consider that. But yeah, more often than not, I mean, scraping those out makes a lot of sense. And then the other part of, I think, the pot odds discussion isn't necessarily the direct pot odds you're getting right that moment, but thinking about the players behind you. So if there's a fish in the blinds, they're going to continue a tremendous amount too. Early position opens, you're on the button, whatever. That could be a better situation to call a couple extra hands because one, fishy players coming along more often. Two, you're getting better pot odds because of what is likely going to happen. But now you're in a spot where you need information. You need to be very, very proactive in your thought process. You also need to consider everything. Not just are there fishy players behind that can call, but what about the aggro players that could squeeze, that are more likely to consider squeezing because you look very, very capped. And yeah, when you're pretty much sitting there and the strongest hand in your calling range is eights, I mean, how often are you ever continuing against a squeeze? Like, never.
And there's actually some really interesting points about defending squeezes where I think, I've just checked a few solves. It's not the most useful situation. But basically, I think you're essentially required to defend a squeeze with all of your hands. And this is GTO. You're required to defend all the hands that you would have called the open raise with versus the squeeze, which is something I think people don't consider. If the original razor folds, that's the caveat. And then if the original razor calls, you're supposed to fold 100% of your hands, except for like, I think if any ace, king, jack mixes you had in, then you can shove those. Yeah, and people don't think about that, which is that like, oh, I actually theoretically need to defend against any squeeze, otherwise it becomes too profitable. And
it's funny. I think most people would take the opposite approach there. They'd call more when the original opener calls, thinking, "Oh, I have pot odds. I'm closing the pot. Sweet," versus it being actually the inverse according to the solver.
Yep. And I think that's because the original razor now has demonstrated they actually have a quite strong range, and all those weaker hands should be deleted from their range. In reality, you may be getting better odds, and it's appropriate to call sometimes here. It's very hard to say exactly at that point, though. It's based on your assumptions and how much advantage you have. But I think the really important thing to remember here is that like the strength of our call range is incredibly important. It determines like how all these variables mix together. So, when someone open raises and you're starting to look at like, playing all your suited connectors, all your suited one gappers, offsuit broadways, we'll see it called a lot in live games. It's very clear that those hands are not good enough to call most raises with unless you have an exploitative advantage. And, there certainly are many situations where you can get an exploitative advantage. I think it tends to come up more in live games because the games get shorter stacks sometimes. Like you're dealing with more short stacks. You're dealing with less open raise aggression. And so you will find more potential situations live. You're like, okay, like I know these players are bad enough. Like I may look at exploring adding some hands to my range. I know I think about that a lot when I'm facing open raises live. How about you? What's your live strat there?
Exact same thing. I just think in general it's too easy to get comfortable estimating your edge and saying, yeah, I'm better than these people and I can start calling a lot. And in a stronger person's case, sure, that's probably true. But one, you got to be real confident of that, and it's very easy to be wrong. And then two, again, just because calling is profitable with maybe a few more hands doesn't necessarily mean that it couldn't be more profitable strategically speaking to just three bet those same exact hands instead. I think it's just way too easy to get comfortable in call, or I need to see a lot of flops. And sure, you have position, and sure, you maybe have some other things that are in your favor too, but I want a lot of things in my favor before I start throwing a bunch of calls into my preflop range. Otherwise, three betting is great, and a lot of this is just based on the fact that, like, people suck at facing three bets. Right. And also, like, as you're hearing this, you're like, well, how are other players in my game calling? And a lot of them are calling exactly the wrong ways that we've discussed this entire episode. And all that means for me is I can squeeze here. I could squeeze here. I could squeeze here. And it's like so much of my preflop win rate is just squeezing. And I squeeze large, so that way I don't give them pot odds, and they hate life, and they fold pretty much 90% of their range, and I just giggle and, scoop up a bunch of medium-sized pots with no rake and no showdown and no complexities, and if they call, well, I don't know, super, super easy to play flops, so who cares?
I actually came up with a strategy based on exactly what you said, the squeezing, where I think when I had started playing live in Vegas, everyone thought I was really tight. And I was playing probably a little extra tight just because I was getting back into the swing of live and all that. Yeah. And I just realized that, like, I was three betting, in a spot, or whenever I was squeezing, I was getting like an immense amount of respect. And I basically just was like, okay, well, I'm just gonna keep track of this, keep track of the frequency of folds and calls in this one spot, and see if I can find an any two card frequency. And basically what it worked out is for about a month, I hit the point where I could three bet any two cards in a squeezing situation. And I needed, sufficient depth, and I needed to have a tight image. Those were the two kind of baked in assumptions. But I was just making money doing that. And it only lasted for a month because people kind of learned how I was playing, and my tightness credibility went way, way, way down pretty rapidly when plays like that started getting added in. But very important to remember that, like, you can come up with really easy auto profit situations. And even though you feel like you're getting odds from those calls, we have to really examine that squeeze first. And if it ever feels thin between call and three bet, you should probably lean towards three bet because your bias will be towards calling.
I think that's 100% fair in that spot. So what else? Any other things we need to consider in this situation? Or is this pretty much hammer? Because, this isn't a super in-depth conversation. It's really just a, hey, please stop calling so damn much. We're really trying to simplify it. The solver kind of likes this kind of strategy as well. If you think about it for like 20 minutes and think about how people in your game will react, you can see, okay, I can probably make a bigger edge by three betting more often than you typically would, and with hands that you would otherwise shunt into your calling range. And obviously, all the hands you would have otherwise called with preflop before, every single suited connector, every single suited gapper, every single ace-x suited, you're not going to be three betting all of the hands that you would have otherwise continued with. You're going to three bet some of them, and you're going to be folding a lot more. So preflop actually gets simpler, should get more profitable as well. Postflop will be easier because you're going to absolutely dominate in three bet pots where most people are not used to studying them or playing in them at all. And I think one thing we really haven't touched on yet is that nobody four bets. Yes, in a live game, exactly. How many four bets do you see per year? Like 5? in live cash, seriously, like 1, 2, and 2, 5. Like, I don't know, maybe a dozen per year. It's not that many.
I can't remember the last time someone four bet me without like maybe jacks plus ace king.
Sure, and that's like a ballsy person.
Yeah.
That's a tag who's working on their game. More often than not, it's exclusively kings plus, maybe even just aces plus. It's like nobody really four bets. And so what are they doing? Well, they're either folding too much or they're calling a lot of three bets. And if they're doing so out of position especially, how complicated is that pot? Spend 20 minutes in Flopzilla and analyze a couple different call versus three bet ranges on a couple different flop textures, and you're going to find every single auto profitable C bet without breaking a sweat. And playing your monsters, it's not that difficult.
Yeah. It's I would say people really underestimate the disadvantages of having a wide call range and the difficulty you'll have playing post flop when that's true. Essentially, when you look at a GTO solve of like what happens when you call with a wide range, you just end up playing way too passive because such a large percentage of your range is weak. And it's funny, it would seem like a type of thing that players wouldn't pick up on, but people kind of know that like, okay, when the like tight guy raised me post flop, like even if he's capable of bluffing, this is really difficult to combat. Whereas when you raise and you got a wide range, it's like you should be kind of fluffy or light, and it's your ability to make those exploitative plays is really dependent on your opponent playing very poorly. And it's just such a big disadvantage that you have to be very, very careful. Like when we think about what a GTL solve is doing, you're giving away money to make this play. So you have to be getting that money back. And people just need to remember that, and I think that applies also to avoiding the three bets that should be standard, your standard GTO three bets that we have in our core ranges and pro GTO ranges that you can go look at. Those are just your three bets. Those should be three bet by default. You don't want to be giving away money to try and make it up by calling, because there's a huge chance that you're overestimating your capability to do so. I actually have a good rule for determining if someone thinks they're skilled at their game. I would say if you can't estimate either using the exploitative statistics for the textures that you encounter post flop, or you can't consistently guesstimate what the GTO frequency is, you do not have enough of a skill edge post flop to be calling a lot.
I think that's totally fair. Yep. So I think most people hearing this should be shifting more of their preflop strategy into more of a three better fold. And obviously, there are spots where calling can be okay, can be better, but you better be damn sure. Otherwise, three better fold. Try it for a couple sessions. I think you might be shocked with what it feels like, what it does to your profit line, and what it even does to how many hands you're playing preflop. You might find yourself playing a little bit tighter and actually confused far less often, both preflop and postflop.
Yeah. I actually have a good judgment call where anytime my strategy starts to exceed 10% calls, I'm almost always certain that it's losing money. And so, live game, you shouldn't be calling a raise more than once per orbit. And in six max, it's, maybe, you should be calling like less than, probably about once per orbit at the very, very most. The very, very most.
Yeah. And for most people, that's probably commonplace in their strategy right this moment. But again, that's like kind of the top side of things.
Yeah.
And again, just because it's profitable does not mean that it's optimal. Start with that.
Yep.
Excellent. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Chris, for hanging out today. And hopefully this helps. If you want to join us at all in conversations, ask any questions for future episodes, don't hesitate to join our Discord, redchippoker.com/Discord, to jump in today. We'd love to see you over there. And until next time, we'll see you next week with another episode. In the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.